Hello, church. Good to be here again with you on this Exodus mini, now number 2. Today we're going to be looking at a few different things. We're going to be looking at author, date, and genre. Basically, what we're doing in this section is trying to get some introductory kind of content so that we can best understand what's going on in the book of Exodus. This information is, I think, valuable. But also probably not necessary in maybe the strictest sense of that. So I would encourage you to watch this, but this will be probably the longest one I do, just by nature of trying to cover so much. I'll try to keep it relatively short, but if take as much out of this as you want, or as little out of this as you want. I will put timestamps for the different parts in the description. So if you want to jump down there on the YouTube channel, you'll be able to find that there. So let's just run through these. First, we're going to talk about the author of the book of Exodus. Very quickly, the view that I hold, the view that we here at Christ Church hold, is that Moses is the primary author of the book of Exodus, with probably some editors at a later date. And I'll try to kind of explain that throughout. This is generally called the traditional view. There is kind of a school within the traditional view that says that Moses wrote every single word, no questions asked. I don't think we hold to that quite so severely, mostly because there's enough within the text itself that just kind of doesn't seem to fit with that approach. And I'll try to show you some of those things here as we go through this. The traditional view stems from a number of places within the scriptures, and I'll run you through these very quickly. Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, and the Lord said to Moses, "Write these down. Write these down." Right. 24:4, then Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Exodus 34:27, write them down. Numbers, Moses wrote down. Deuteronomy, Moses wrote down the song. So what we can acknowledge from this is, number one, there's no this doesn't necessarily mean that Moses wrote all of the Torah, right? And that's primarily what we're talking about when we're talking about the author of the book of Exodus, or the authorship here. When we talk about authorship, when it comes to any of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it kind of all goes together. They are very clearly a contained unit. This is something that I mentioned on Sunday. Tremper Longman points out that the first 5 books of the Bible are kind of one story. The exit from God rescuing his people from bondage and taking them to a place of promise, where Genesis is sort of this prologue to the story. And so when we're talking about authorship, we are talking about authorship for the whole of the Torah, not just the book of Exodus, but certainly obviously includes the book of Exodus. And these verses, they don't necessarily mean that Moses wrote everything. They just simply kind of give us an indication, sort of lean us in a particular direction. Then as we go through some of the other parts of the Old Testament, we see references, or other parts of Scripture, we see references here, say in Joshua, which is the next book after Deuteronomy. And it says, be careful to observe the instruction my servant Moses commanded you. And then the same reference here. This is the book of instruction that you must not depart. This is probably the testament to Moses writing Torah. Then 2 Chronicles, we have something similar. However, he did not put their children to death, because as it is written in the law in the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers shall not be put to death, or Nehemiah. At this time, the book of Moses was read publicly. Even Matthew, Jesus refers here, or Jesus is being asked a question. Teacher, Moses said, right? Moses said, and then he references what follows is Deuteronomy 25, 5 to 10. Or in Mark, again, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother, Exodus 20:12, that's the 10 Commandments. Or John, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus Christ. So all of these just kind of point to sort of a tradition of calling the Torah the books of Moses, or the law of Moses. Again, very similar to what I just said, we have to recognize that just because something is called the book of doesn't necessarily mean that Moses is the author. It could just mean that Moses is the primary character, which is very true of the Torah. But again, this is sort of pushing us or kind of propping us this direction. And then tradition takes over, and tradition from the early church, early Christian church, even further back to the Old Testament in general. The further along in history you go, the more likely it is that you're going to see traditions say that Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. And so because of the weight of that, we kind of have to say, you really do need to convince me otherwise before I kind of go into a different direction. Some of the maybe challenges to this, to Moses being the only author, come from what we call post-Mosaic texts. So this Deuteronomy 34:5, really all of Deuteronomy 34 doesn't really make sense to come from Moses, because this is where Moses died, right? Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there. Not will die, but past tense, died. Maybe Moses wrote this, but again, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Or Genesis 11:31, we see Ur of the Chaldeans, but that phrase Ur of the Chaldeans, or Chaldeans, is not the term that would have been used during the time of Moses, right? It would have been a different term. The Chaldean term comes in when Babylon becomes a little bit more of a powerhouse nation. Similar, they pursued them as far as Dan, and this is in Genesis 14. So the story here is referring to a place that does not come into existence until the book of Joshua. Yes, there's a couple times when Moses references what people are going to do in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, I think. But the actual events are later, right, to be a place that they refer to. So probably what's happening here is that Moses maybe referenced a different place that has had a name change, giving maybe some confusion to later people, right? And we do very similar things, say, with our Bible translations. Like, we don't really, in more modern Bible translations, CSB included in this, we don't use cubits, right? A cubit is a measurement from the base of your elbow to the tip of your finger, but most people don't know that just off the top of their head. And so instead of going, well, we interpret that this is about 18 inches, and so we'll interpret it for you. So we change it so that it makes more sense just to the average reader. And then there's one called, it's not a post-Mosaic, it's called an a-Mosaica, because it just doesn't really seem to make sense coming from Moses, right? It says Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone. Like, a humble person doesn't actually say this, right? A humble person doesn't say, I'm humble. They just simply are humble. And so that's kind of where the foundation comes from for both thinking that it's a Mosaic authorship, but also recognizing that there's probably some editing that's going on at later points, but primarily coming from Moses. The counter view, and I'll cover this very, very quickly. I'm not going to take a bunch of time to explain this. The counter view is that is called the documentary hypothesis, which basically concludes or basically says that there is enough internal evidence that there's different motivations for different parts of the text itself, that means it's coming from different authors. And there's kind of two schools of thought within this. There's a three authorship school of thought and a four authorship school of thought. Sometimes Moses is included in that, but most of the time it's coming from even as late as the Babylonian exile, right? So hundreds of years later, some of these things are starting, like they're saying, oh, that's piecing together different parts or different traditions. And again, I'm not going to necessarily get into all these, but I will give you a few examples of why. So Genesis chapters 1 and 2, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 seem to have contradictory order of creation. Genesis 1, vegetation happens on day 3, and then God makes man and woman on day 6. In Genesis chapter 2, God makes man first, and then vegetation comes after. And part of the reason why this doesn't pose that big of a problem is because Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are not really, the purpose is not chronological history. And so we can recognize the genre difference between Genesis and Exodus, but we can also recognize the purpose of what is actually being said. And so that kind of loosens up our need for it to be exactly meshed together. Again, it's a broader subject than that, but also Genesis 37, 27, and 28. We hear this is part of the story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. And in the story, we're told that they see the Ishmaelites are coming. But then in verse 28, it says, when the Midianite traders passed by, and then they paid him 20 pieces to the Ishmaelites. So who is it? The Ishmaelites or Midianites? And they're like, oh, they're blending the story. Number one, that doesn't really make all that much sense. If you're going to blend the story, you're going to make it uniform. You're not just going to smash the two pages together and somehow come up with a story. But basically what's going on, and this is something that Longman points out that I'm borrowing from him, right? Like, I'm from Ohio, but I'm also from the United States. So you could call me an Ohioan and you can call me an American, and both are true and both are equally accurate. And the same thing is happening here. And I'm pretty sure that the Midianites are like the more narrow strip within the Ishmaelite community. I might be backwards on that, but that kind of answers that. Then there's a couple more. And I'll do these real quick. There's a couple places where there's a double naming. Sinai is called Sinai and Haran. In Genesis, we see this the most in Genesis. Genesis has a couple places where the stories are doubled, but then also there is a using of one name versus the other. So Genesis chapter 1, we have the use of Elohim, exclusively Elohim in Genesis chapter 1, and then in Genesis chapter 2, mostly Yahweh in Genesis chapter 2. Yahweh being the more personal divine name of God, and Elohim being more the generic or general word for God. And usually how we describe the kind of the balance between these two things is in the passages where we see Elohim being used. It seems like the story is much more kind of cosmic in its nature and not as personal, whereas when when Yahweh is used, much more personal. Genesis 1 is very cosmic in its scope. Genesis 2 is much more personal in its scope. God is creating with speech in Genesis 1, but God is creating with his breath in Genesis 2. That is a duplicate account. We see a duplicate account in creation. We see a duplicate account in the flood, and similar things are happening there, right? And so what they often do is they say, oh, well, the one is we call it the E document because it's Elohim, and one is the J document, which is just a way we can refer to Yahweh, is the Yahweh document. And so we're blending these things together, but we have some reasons for that. And then one which I think is kind of a struggle to just write like I have it in here. The last one is different theologies, and it's debatable whether they're different theologies. The example that we can use is in earlier parts of Torah. it seems to be permissible to have different places for altars. You can have different altars and different styles and whatever. And then at the end of Deuteronomy, it says that there's only one place. There's only going to be one place where you can have a temple, or where you can have sacrifices. And that's really just a progression rather than a difference in theology. Things are growing and changing. My view, our view, very simply, is, like I said, is the traditional view. Recognizing Moses is probably the primary author, writing most of the book, most of Torah, and then having edits and parts being written by other contributors over time. What we care about more than anything else is that final form, right? What we're saying is the inspired word of God is the final form that is solidified long before Jesus comes, right? That has been the tradition for a very, very long time. And so that's the view on authorship. Date. The dating of the book of Exodus, now the book of Exodus more specifically, is a little bit of a challenge, and it's mostly a challenge for one very specific reason. So when we get into 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, it says, Solomon began to build the temple for the Lord in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of his reign, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month. So 480th year, that's a very specific time, or that's an amount of time. It's actually not a specific time. It's a very kind of general time. Seems like a very general time that's happening. But we also have a date for the beginning of the first temple through Solomon. We get to Solomon. Now we're getting into history that is verified and kind of confirmed by not extra biblical or outside of the Bible sources. We have, say, a reference to David in some Semitic texts. We have a few more references to Solomon in some Semitic texts. And the further on you go in, say, Kings and Chronicles, the more you see outside of the Bible references to these characters. So we're much more confident when this happens, and we can put a date on it. It's actually 962 BC is when the the first temple is being built. And so if you take 460 years before that, that's basically 1440. That's around that time frame, 1440. Now the struggle that we have with 1440 is that it doesn't necessarily mesh up great with the Exodus, or with Egyptian history. It's a little bit more. It's a little bit less clear that would have fit in there. I'm not saying that it's not clear. I'm saying that it's a little bit less clear, right? And I'll come back to that in just a second. The other way that we can view the 460 reference in 1 Kings is numerologically, okay, which means 460 is 12, or 480. I keep saying 460. 480 is 12 40s, 12 times 40. 12 is a important number for the people of Israel. There's 12 tribes. There's 12 lots of things, right? 12 is kind of a completeness number or a wholeness number. 40 is a generational number, meaning that's typically what's given to refer to a generation of people. Now, what the challenge is that a generation of people isn't actually 40 years. It's probably much closer to 25 years. So if we take kind of a numerological approach to the 480 years, then it's maybe more like 300 years, which then puts the Exodus somewhere in 1260. And then that fits a little bit better with some Egyptian history. Now, the main thing with Egyptian history is that there's no accounting of a large group of Hebrews being enslaved, being set free, and then the destruction of an army, right? Like, that's not in Egyptian records. But it's also not that surprising that it's not in Egyptian records, because the Egyptians are notorious for kind of clearing off the bad news of their historic events, right? And so they can wash and cleanse their historic record to not show this massive failure, right? And so going from just from that, let's just talk through some of the things that would happen here. So if 1260 BC is the general time frame, here are the three kings that we would see, or three pharaohs that would potentially be part of their time there. Seti the first, Ramesses the second, and Merneptah. I don't know how to say that the right way. You can see their time frames there. But some of the things that are recorded of these people from Egyptian history is Seti is recorded to be very harsh, which fits with harsh punishment of the Jewish people. He began moving the Egyptians downstream, which is technically north towards the Nile Delta. He was the one who began that move, and that therefore means that he built a bunch of cities and places, big building projects, which easily could be what is talked about for the Egyptians in the book of Exodus, specifically Exodus 1:11, that they built the supply cities of Pithom and Ramesses. His son, who succeeds him, Ramesses II, is said to have finished or said to have built the supply cities Pithom and Ramesses, right? And so that fits really kind of nicely. And then there's the third guy there, Merneptah. He had a statue built of himself, something like a 12-foot tall statue, and on it is an inscription that says something along the lines of Canaan is plundered with every hardship, and Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. Basically, I wiped out the Israelites, which could be his way of kind of making it look nice, making it look kosher, if you will, right? Like they left and got away, and we got beat up a little bit. So what should I say? Oh, we just killed everybody. We wiped them out, right? Like it fits with sort of the type of approach that the Egyptians might have had. But that again doesn't say that 1440 is an impossible option. Amenhotep the second and Tutmosis the third would have been the pharaoh's 1440, so it's further back in time, right? Don't get confused with the BC. Further back in Tutmosis is documented to having massive building projects, just like Seti and Ramesses the second. Ramesses is sort of an anachronistic name that is often used after the fact, right? So these characters are these names are used sort of like what we did with like Washington or Lincoln. You go to almost every state in the United States and there's a Washington, Ohio, or a Lincoln, Ohio, or whatever, different places, because these are very important names to our history. Same thing is true in renaming things, right? So I go in and I as Ramesses II, 200 years from now, I go into these cities that even though Tutmosis built them, I'm going to rename them Ramesses, or even my son or grandson renames them Ramesses. And again, maybe Moses put in the actual names, and then later on they were renamed or in the text itself so that the people who are reading it would know what is being referred to. I think that makes sense. But really the hardest obstacle is the Hebrew records, right? Like that's the hardest thing to get past. Like, wouldn't there be some kind of record? But again, the Egyptians are famous for cleansing their histories from any bad news. And then the other hard one is, wouldn't there be evidence of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years? Yes and no. That makes sense to why you would think that, but they were nomads. They weren't building cities. They weren't settled in a particular place for a long period of time. And archaeological digs are extremely, extremely, extremely scarce in the Middle East. Like we kind of think that, oh, everything has been excavated. No, it hasn't. A tiny, tiny percentage of the biblical world has been excavated. And so maybe we just haven't seen any of the evidence. In essence, what we have to say is that either dating is completely plausible. It's completely plausible. There's no reason we have to say one or the other. Maybe the two challenges to a later dating to 1260 is a reference here in Judges that it's 300 years after they were in Heshbon, or in Acts whenever Paul refers to the exodus from Canaan, or the conquest of Canaan, and then 450 years, and then the Judges. There's some questions about that, and they're reasonable questions, but the main thing that I say to those is the same numerological kind of approach can be taken with those approaches as well. I tend to lean towards the 1260 mark because the historic evidence seems to be a little bit greater, and it still fits within the genre and the purpose of Torah, of Joshua, of Acts, of all these different references that we just looked at. Last genre, and I'll do this really quickly. The genre of the book of Exodus, now again specifically the book of Exodus, is what we call is theological history. Now, there's theological history in all the parts of the Torah, but here we're talking primarily about the book of Exodus. Yes, there is law in the second half of the book of Exodus, but the bulk of the narrative is what we call theological history. And we have to recognize really two main things. Number one, modern history has a different purpose and a different motive. Modern history cares about chronological evidence of events. But we also have to remember that to the victor, go the records. To the victor go the records. If Germany would have won World War II, history would have been written different, even though the same events would have happened, right? Like, all history is biased history. Every single bit of history is biased history. And I'm not saying that to say that Exodus is a lie or a fabrication. What I'm saying is that we have to recognize that number one, we live in a different time, but also this is very much a part of historic accounting, right? But the thing that makes biblical history different is that it is theological first, right? It is first about what is the relationship between God and man. What is the relationship between God and his people, Israel? And that's the primary thing that is being taught in the historic event, which means there are some things that we as modern historians would put in there that aren't in the book of Exodus. And there are things that we wouldn't put in the book of Exodus that are in there because the main point is the theology before the accounting of the time, right? Again, not saying that the accounting of the time is unimportant or is false. It's just the theology is first, right? And when push comes to shove, theology wins. So we do have to say, and you have to believe, it's not just a good story. It is historical. It's not just a good story. Because if we say that it's just a good story, then we miss part of the main point of the book of Exodus. One of the main points of the book of Exodus is that God works and moves in human history as a mechanism of his saving grace, of his saving work. And if it's not historical, if it's just a hypothetical God could work, it really does deflate the book of Exodus. If it's just a good story, a made-up story, then it's kind of a silly story. And it's also kind of a silly story if you think about the audacity of a nation like Israel, the Hebrew people, saying, "Oh yeah, we exited the most powerful nation on earth, and oh by the way, defeated their armies in the river." Like that's a crazy story to tell if there's no truth behind it, right? And so that's a main thing that we have to take note of. The one thing that I would say, I guess, as a concluding thought here, this is a reference to some of the resources that I've pulled from. I want to particularly point out. I said this on Sunday, but this one by Tremper Longman, excuse me, is maybe the most valuable one. But then this guy here, he's the next most important. Obviously, the Bible is really important, but that's all I have. We'll see you on Sunday.